then fell into the programming bug, and then came circle around into user experience, which I absolutely love and adore. Today, we're going to be talking about design artifacts, and what you're going to learn is how design artifacts are essential to your UX practice. And what I want you to get out of this is how to know when to use a sitemap or a user flow and the difference between each of them. And we're going to talk about something very specific, which is the idea of content layers, which you can use to look at complexity and break it up into certain segments so that you can understand where something might be more complex and where you don't have to use things that are more complex. And we'll show how that fits within each of the sitemaps and the flowcharts. If you have any questions, please take note of them, and I will get back to them at the end of the presentation. Okay, let's begin. So what's a design artifact? A design artifact is essentially a drawing. Drawings are ways that you record observations. When I was in art school, it blew my mind where I learned that drawings were just simply a record of my observations. In the user experience world, they can be mind, concept, site maps, empathy maps. They could be user flows and flow charts. If you go onward and forward, they could be personas. And when you start to collaborate with people, they can be affinity walls. You could use wireframes. They're any type of tangible document that you could use to communicate a concept. It's an area where you can use to think about your ideas. Today, we're going to be talking about flowcharts and sitemaps and what's the difference between them. Sometimes people get confused. They don't know how to use them or where they should be used. So flowcharts describe how a task should be completed. That's really all it is. It's the basis of a flowchart. You have an objective and you want to communicate what is the best way to get there. Sitemaps, you could break up into two kind of segments. One, they define hierarchy, and the second is they provide navigational clarity. So if we look at the examples that are on the screen, we could see that the flowchart starts with how much, and you have triangles or ways to communicate a decision. So I'm here, do I do this or do I do that? Which way do I go? Yes or no, or maybe. Sitemaps can be very top-down if they're describing a hierarchy, or they could be something that is more so central-based and comes out to the margins. Let's look at an anatomy of a flowchart. So flowcharts focus on a clear outcome. They document a particular process. We translate that process into the user experience by looking at the flowchart to see which direction a person can go, here or there. When you apply a persona to a flowchart, you get a user flow. And if you understand personas, they're avatars that you put on so that you can remove yourself from a situation and see what you're trying to do through the scope or the eyes of another person. They take the form of questions or problems that the person is trying to solve. Flowcharts also can communicate what we call the happy path. The happy path is the way that a person can get from here to there in the most direct fashion. If everything goes right and we do our job right, people will fall along the happy path. Sitemaps can be hierarchical. And when you look at a document and you see that it has a clear logical structure, that it pretty much forms a grid layout, you could make the relationship between parent and child objects. And nodes seem to be chunked and belong together, you could probably be sure that this is a sitemap that is hierarchical. Another type of sitemap is navigational, and this could be hub and spoke. It communicates varied paths, and it has no labels on connecting lines. So it shows you where you could possibly go, but it doesn't necessarily give you the most specific direction. And it doesn't use a grid, or it doesn't have to use a grid. And those are ways visually that you could understand what is a sitemap, what type of sitemap is, and if it is a flowchart or not. So how do you make sense of this mess? if you're looking at the world, if you're looking at a structure, if you have an objective, if you are trying to figure out a problem, you can use these design artifacts in your notebooks and in your drawings to throw down and put down your ideas and move things around. And the idea between using this in your personal life and your professional life, which is you're going to present to clients, is that in your notebooks and your sketchbooks, you could be very messy. You don't have to worry about necessarily obtaining a perfect structure. It should look good. We always see online people post these beautiful, beautiful drawings of their notebooks. And that's great. But the creative process and the thinking process allows you to be messy. And so here I picked a visual of, you could see, here we have a home. It's definitely going to show you the site map and where somebody's going. And it's very, very fluid. It's your way of thinking out loud and putting your ideas out of your head onto a piece of paper, which is one of the most direct ways for you to formulate and make a process in your mind plastic and real. One of the secrets in using design artifacts is to think in content layers. Because when you're going through all this messy stuff, what happens is you might not have a good idea about what is needed, what is to be something on the flanker, on the margins, or something that is essential. So what we want to do is we want to think in terms of content layers. And in content layers, for every design artifact, you can apply a content layer to anything that you're making. So say you're drawing and you're putting some ideas down, you ask yourself some questions. For example, what is the essential information that I'm trying to do? What is the outcome the user's trying to accomplish? Or what is the bare minimum that we need to communicate? And that clears out all this clutter. And that's the first layer. And you could see that in the example on the screen where we have number one. It just shows you simple rectangular box with maybe some decisions, and it's very clear. The second layer is embellishments. Embellishments are any additional information that you can provide that would provide clarity. So for example, say you go to a specific state and there's a little interaction in there. You can communicate what that interaction is and how it relates to where you are in the state. The idea with the embellishment layer is that you don't necessarily need it. If you remove it from your diagram, if you don't include it, you don't really lose the essential information. And finally, the third content layer that you can lay on top of it is something that will provide more context and connections. One of the things that we do in user experience is we have to explicitly state what context we're in. When you are walking around the world, when you are existing in an environment, your body, all your senses provides amazing information about the context that you're in. But when we translate it and we design something, we have to compensate for that. And we have to make connections because we can't be sure that a person is going to understand where we're exactly coming from. This is one of the reasons why personas are really important. What we do in this third layer is add additional context and connections so that you could say, at this moment in time, at this state, this is what exists, and we're focusing on this right now because this is the essential information that we're using. So when you go through and you create your design artifacts and you're sitting there and you're drawing, you're doing things, you could say, okay, what's essential? Oh, what am I going to use to embellish this? Or what connections or context can I clarify so that I can make this clearer? So here's a real world example for us. If we were in a longer class, I would set it up so that we could actually work on this together. But for now, I'm going to walk through something that I just created in a project a couple months ago. I worked on a site called 7 Cups, which is an amazing app and service where anybody can talk online anonymously to a trained listener and talk about issues that you're going through. If you want somebody to talk to, if you're going through some problems, they provide an empathetic ear to help you work through your problems. And one of the reasons I was hired was because their app was having a lot of abandonment. Users couldn't find community sections. They didn't really know what services the app provided, and the app chronically crashed. So my first job was to look at this and say, well, how can we make this better? And here's the visual of the first screen that you saw when you actually logged into the app. You saw that you were on something that was called a growth path. There were these things that looked like cups. You definitely were on the path. You could see in the tab bar on the bottom, and there's something called chat, but you really didn't know what to do. And users who would come in couldn't really find a community section. They couldn't figure out where they would go or what they would do. So the first thing that I did was I created a site map. I went through the current state of it, and I said, okay, from this moment, I'm going to just draw it out and figure out what are my options that are available to me. And I did this in a notebook, and I set out pieces of paper, and I just draw it with Post-it notes. And it was pretty messy because I really was trying to understand, well, what is my role? What am I trying to do? So here we see the initial screen on the left-hand side that I showed in the previous slide. And then we could see the menu that comes out when you hit the hamburger menu in the upper left-hand corner. So I made a map of the current state of what my options are. So I go through the auth gate, I land on the path screen, I can go to the chat screen, and really the two options that I have are the menu and the search. So the menu consists of notifications, alerts, what county I'm in, listeners, and then there's this really interesting thing called the search, which I expected to be a text field. But when I went there, it was a simple list of issues that people might have. It really wasn't a search functioning. It was more like another menu. And I thought that was really odd. So I played around with it, and I thought, well, if I was a person looking for a community and I tried on my avatar, what would I try to do? So taking this avatar, I made a user flow. So I would say, this is me as a person. I go through the auth gate, I land on a path. And now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get to the community. So if I'm on the screen, do I see community? Well, no, I don't even have an option to see community. Do I look in the menu? Well, I could look in the menu. Oh, look, I could see community. Okay. I have also on the main screen a chat window. Can I go to the chat tab? Well, if I went to the chat, I wouldn't be able to find community anyway. So really my only path here was to go through from the main screen that I was on into the main menu and go into community. The benefit here of this design artifact is we could actually see now where we can and cannot go. We could see what's available. We would only be able to get to community if we went in one place. By using this design artifact, which was derived from the previous site map, I could see that, oh, if I made the community screen accessible in different places and rearrange things and maybe made things clearer, it would be self-evident where I would need to go. And that was my path forward. The great thing about all these design artifacts is that they're usually used to get together, a site map, a user flow, an affinity board. You could use all these together in a process, cherry picking what you need for whatever you need to accomplish. So here's my updated site map. I went through this and I said, okay, well, what I would really want to do is have a home screen, because on this particular app, there is a lot more services than just chatting or what have you. And then on there, I thought, well, maybe it would be a good idea to communicate for new users what actually these services did. So here, when you came and you went through the auth gate, you landed on a homes page. And then we saw very clearly there was a chat, community, a growth path. And as you came down it, and as you worked within the app, probably over time, these would disappear because you would understand what they would be. But really, you would be able to see recent activity, things that you were familiar with. And then what I did was I looked at the hamburger menu and I decided to rearrange it. I tried to chunk together information. So we have a home screen, we had chat, community paths, which were the three major services that the app provided. And then very clearly chunking together different types of contextual services so that the user would be able to look at it and understand, oh, there's a relationship between therapists and listeners. Then on the sitemap, I drew it out so that from the home screen, you can get to the pages or the screens from a direct link from home. You can get it to it from any of the menus, or the tab bar would also get you there. So depending upon how you approached the app and what your needs were, what your mental state were, you had 3 different ways to get to all these main functions. Sometimes an older user might just focus on the hamburger menu because it was very linear. And in usability testing, I found out that younger individuals who are more accustomed to the way things are on the web would never even touch the user menu. They would always go and just do everything from the screens. To go back and to look at the updated user flow, I said, okay, well, once I go through the auth gate, now I'm going to be on the home page rather than the path page. And from there, I could see my happy path. I can go right into community because it's right in front of me, and I could go right to that page. If I was focused on just using the tab bar, I would be able to explore that from there by picking my other options. Or I could look in the menu and I could easily find where I am on the community screen. So this is a way of using design artifacts to take note of a state that you're on so that you know the playing field that you're working with, and then derive a user flow or something else about how to actually use the interface or the service that you're on. And then taking that and saying, okay, now that we have this, what is the place where I'm going to? For this presentation, I'm just focusing on the basic information. If I wanted to add an embellishment, I could go back to, actually, no, we could look at this. If we look at this sitemap, you could see that I could have just used the basic information of just saying, hey, this is the menu. I didn't have to put the embellishments on it of what the actual links are or the chunks. That's an example of me adding more information that could be taken away, but it's not really essential. If I just had the idea that you can go to either to the home menu or the search menu, it would be good enough to show what the options are. Here, I added these embellishments to give you more information. If I remove them, it really wouldn't be that much of a difference. So why are flowcharts and sitemaps your best friends? Well, they provide a clear, practical format to test and record observations. As you go around and you look at things, it's really important to draw out ideas. And if you know the types of tools that are available to you, like, oh, I could turn this into a flowchart, and this is what a flowchart does, or I could use a sitemap, and this is the purpose of it, you can figure out what you're trying to do in an easier way because you already have a strategy. The specific design artifact gives you a strategy to help you solve your problem. If you do it with a specific goal in mind, an outcome, let's say, they help you understand the interaction dynamics. So for example, for the previous example I gave you, it was more like, hey, listen, the individual can't find the community page. So that was the outcome I was choosing to apply. And that gave me a direction on how to use something. If I use design artifacts, I could take abstract structures in my head and make them tangible so I could talk to them. I could show something. I could say, here's where we are and this is what we're going to do. And if I present these as sketches and not something so as clean as I did in the previous examples, but if I showed actual drawings, individuals immediately understand that this is a work in progress, that it gives the permission for the collaborators to say, hey, this could be wrong, or this is something that's not finalized, so I need your input. And it opens up a space so you could have really great, clear conversations with people who might not think in a design type of way. And the other great thing is that design artifacts could just be kept to yourself. You don't really have to share them with anybody. I have always a Moleskine sketchbook with me that I draw consistently, and it's messy and things are ill-formed, or I have Post-it notes, but that's for me. That's something where I go back. And if I choose to communicate it to a stakeholder, I can clean it up in like OmniGraph Pro or some type of sketch program, and I can make it nice, but really they're my notes and they're my place where I could think things through and solidify ideas or abandon ideas. Back when I was an art student, I went to the Art Students League of New York, and they had a great saying. Their great saying was nulla die sine linea, which is, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right because it's Latin. It's no day without a line. Always keep a sketchbook with you, and always keep a pen and paper around. And as you go around your world, a great way of learning how to do design artifacts and getting really used to them, not just on a project, is to see how you can translate an interaction in real life in a type of user flow or a flow chart or a sitemap of where you are. Certain things that you could do is that you could, if you're waiting in a grocery store, you can look and observe how people try to find something. You can look at parking lots. Parking lots are really brilliant to practice doing sitemaps and user flows, because the architect has already given you what they thought conceptually where you should go. There's arrows, there's lines, there's mediums, there's things. And you could see when people drive to a parking lot, well, they really want to go over there, but then they have to go around. And that's a user experience that might cause frustration. So if you sit down and you made a user flow of that, you could look at the real world situation and say, well, if I was charged with updating this, what I could do is rearrange these in this different way to make it less frustrating. I personally love going to airports and watching people find things, because airports provide a really interesting place to see people out of their context. They definitely have a clear outcome, but they might not know the environment that they're in, and they have a lot of stuff that they're working on. So sitting in an airport and watching people, you can see people either clearly fail at trying to get to where they need to be, or if the signage is correct or they have an understanding of it, you could see them looking for something, finding it, and going off. And that gives you a great opportunity to sit down and draw. The most important thing to remember always is to observe, explore, and discover, and play. The great thing about being a designer is that we get paid to play. We get paid to look at and create things in the world that are amazing and solve problems. Reducing user frustration is so much fun, because you can look at how things are being done and you could say, well, if we did it like this, we could probably solve a lot of problems. And that could be very playful. For creating user flows and maps, I find that an app or a sketchbook is a great way of putting ideas down. In the real world, on paper, UI stencils have these great tools that you could use. They're little rulers that you can use to create user flows and storyboards and things, and very quickly jot things down. I carry a version of a stencil with me all the time, so that when I'm thinking about things, I could just pull it out and I could focus not on drawing a perfect person or a perfect rectangle, but I could keep the focus of the problem I'm trying to solve in my head. Recently, I found a great app called Graphio on an iPad, if you have an iPad or an Android, and it makes creating design artifacts really, really simple. You can simply drag and drop, and it's very forgiving. And you can do different types of layers and concept maps with it to show different structures and relationships. And it's quite effortless. And that's my presentation. If you have any questions about anything I showed, I would love to take any questions. Anyone?
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Olu. I'm a UX student. And I have a question about your sitemaps. Do you create sitemaps for every interaction on your mobile app? Because when you broke it down, you know, how everything has to look, most especially from your hamburger menu, I realized sometimes, with the exception of the hamburger menu, there are some other interaction within an app or within a product that the user has to go through some processes. Do we have to create sitemaps for every interaction?
No, you don't. The great thing about design artifacts is some things are really clear. Sometimes you look at it and you think, oh, okay, well, when I looked at the app the first time, I was like, all right, we have a serious issue with hierarchy. You know, when you look at the hamburger menu, it's like, wow, I don't even have the ability here to be centered, right? There's no home screen or there's no what have you. So you choose to create the artifact that's based upon what you need to communicate or what you need to work out. Don't feel the need that you have to have this complete 100% solidified, perfect map. That's not what it's for. That's going to create anxiety that you don't need. You don't need that. All right. What you do need to do is focus on this problem. That's why I say if you have an outcome that you're trying to solve, then use that to provide clarity in that. Don't put that added pressure on yourself because it's not needed. And honestly, I've had people giving me wireframes that have 300 wireframes and every little bit is done. But it took them 9 months to actually do that. And they gave it to me when I was working as a developer because I really needed to have that. So for what you're doing, if that's the requirement, you might want to say, well, we need to do this if we're communicating it, but don't keep that pressure on yourself. Focus on the task at hand. And that works great, especially in agile sprints when you're just focusing on one or two things. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Do you know the difference between the sitemap and a user flow?
Oh, yes, I do.
Okay. Do you know how to transform a flowchart into a user flow through a persona?
Oh, yes, I do.
Okay.
After all that, yes.
Okay. Do you use sitemaps? Do you use user flows? Is that your first go-to when you start working out?
I use user flows, and
Yes.
I just started my last project we had 2 weeks ago was when I started using sitemaps, but I didn't follow my sitemaps in detail on like the way I use my user flows because
Okay.
yeah, most of the time my user flows actually gives me everything I want.
Right.
I spend a lot of time on my user flow. Sometimes I spend close to like a whole day on my user flow to be careful about where I want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And but when I start my design process, I go back to my user flow. And like I said, I don't use sitemaps, but my last 2 projects, from my user flow, I realized I needed to break a certain flow down. So I used a sitemap and it gave me a bunch of other screens that I didn't recognize. So that was just basically, but with this brown bag now, I think I concentrate more on my sitemaps now to give me more direction.
It's very interesting. I used to work solely with user flows, and I used to be really focused because I'm like, I'm going to be an advocate for the user. And then really about a year and a half ago, I had a friend show me, well, look at these sitemaps. I said, but sitemaps, I'm working on apps now. That's all web stuff. And I'm like, no, look at this. And she showed me a really interesting concept. What she did was she took sitemaps and she made it so that she understood the scope of it.
Okay.
And then for each individual persona, she would say, this person is going to start here, and she would highlight the happy path. And then she would layer all the sitemaps on top of each other. So you had these really interesting mishmashes of a user flow and a sitemap. And then when you saw it together, you would actually be able to turn them on and off, and you would like see the interactions appear on your sitemap. Mm-hmm. And then gaps would be really apparent to be like, wow, there's nobody over here. Why are we doing this? Or, maybe we should move this over here and make it more prominent because it doesn't seem people can get there. And it became this very interactive thing where she was just playing with layers, and it blew my mind. And I'm like, oh, I'm so going to do that. So,
yeah, thanks.
Yep. Any other questions? Do you carry a sketchbook with you throughout your day? Do you find yourself looking at things, or do you only scope that when you're working on a project? All
right. I really don't carry sketchbooks around, even though sometimes I always have a notepad in code. Mm-hmm. I always put my car. But when I walk around in store, I don't put sketchbooks, but I always watch what people do. And a couple of times I've had encounter with security men looking at me like, what do you want? Because sometimes I tend to learn to look for problems, not to look for problems, then find a way for a solution. And like I always tell my instructors in class that I am very poor when it comes to sketching on paper. it's something I always struggle with. Most times when I try it, I barely go past 3 screens to stop using it. But when I get a whiteboard, sometimes I tend to write on the wall.
Right.
That makes it easier for me. So, and with that, whatever I see outside, I tend to put it into my design. Something like, okay, if I go to Kroger, I see a lot of wait times, like, okay, how do we break it down? They have a lane for those with 5 items. So, but you keep on seeing people with more than 10 items on that same lane. So I tend to look like, okay, how do you make this very user appealing so that there's a user experience? And every time I go to Kroger, I always try to watch a lane to see how can I come up with a solution. But as I speak to you, I've not gotten a solution. So I don't know how I will start sketching on paper, because I will tell my instructors, because I just don't know why. Nothing comes when I take a pencil and paper. Nothing comes. But when I see a whiteboard or a wall, sometimes I tend to write on walls.
Okay.
When I sit on my MacBook, I tend to come up with something now. I do better on Microsoft, on Excel, than to bring down my thoughts. So it's something I've been trying to look for. But when it comes to looking around, yes, I do. Sometimes when I walk, I try to look like, how would the government put a road sign here? Why not here? Because, trying to find solutions to every problem I tend to see around me. So, and I always make sure most of those things I bring into my design. No, absolutely. So I make sure, okay, yes, if this happens, what should happen? Then I started learning a lot of empathy, how to be forgiving. A lot of users don't want to take some action. They take some action by mistake, but we should always forgive. While some don't actually have the forgiveness. Like everybody uses InVision. And there's a problem with InVision Mobile. No matter the screen you open, you either swipe right or left. If I want to get out of the project to go to the next project, you can't. You have to close the entire app and load another one. So I keep wondering why InVision never saw that problem.
My pet peeve is looking at user experience tools that have horrible user experience.
Yes. So it's something I always look like, okay, should I just walk around something around and create a portfolio around that for them? Probably someone in InVision will be able to see it, because even though I love you're testing my apps on InVision Mobile, right? But because of that experience alone, if I re-upload a new screen, I can't get to see that screen on my mobile. I have to close the entire app, then relaunch, then try to load over 300 screens I have to get to the bottom of the page. So it's a terrible experience. So I always tend to go back to the web.
I hear that. I think that going back to your when you say that, you have trouble drawing everything, it's really important to lead with what's most comfortable for you. Like I could draw before I could speak. Like when I was a little kid, I was really small and I would be drawing things and my mom would just look at me and she'd tell stories of me just making these drawings. And it just seemed very natural for me. So that's my go-to. If you make lists, just make lists. I carry my iPhone, of course, with me all the time, and I'm always taking pictures. I'm always looking at inconsistencies and like, oh, this is a fail. Like this is a sharp corner where there shouldn't be a sharp corner. And I'm always looking at the world and being fascinated by it, by thinking, man, I wish I had an opportunity to redesign that, because this was either they didn't have the budget for it, maybe they didn't have the time to do it, maybe they didn't have the consciousness of that, or maybe it wasn't a consideration at all. They just needed to get this done, and that's fine, but things can always be better. And the weird thing that we go through working on digital apps is that we may feel that we're disconnected. Like, there's a big movement to just put your phone down, get away from your phone. Don't be so focused on your screen. And that disconnect that we have between what we see in this two-dimensional world and the real world can be bridged by taking exercises that you would apply to a digital world into a real world. And then you have this tactile, you have this idea of plasticity, this real materialness, that when you go back to it, you would think, oh, here's a very interesting way. I remember doing this, and this actually gives me a new gesture, and I could apply that here.
Mhm.
The more you bridge the real world and the digital world, the better you're going to get. And the more that you create artifacts about your observations, even if they're bullet point lists or if they're little squares or if they're stick figures, it doesn't really matter. The most important thing is to record your observation and always be listening, always listen, and always have that empathetic ear, because it's our job to advocate for the user. A stakeholder is going to advocate for themselves. We need to be able to say, I see that, and this person is going to try to do that. So let's see if we can do it together, or let's see if it's the user, because the user is going to make your product successful. And that's what we want to do. And so the more we do it, the more notes you take, the better you're going to get. And it's going to come out really easy.
All right. Thank you. One more question.
Yes.
So how do you handle developers? Where
For me, that's easy because I spent years as a software engineer.
Okay. Yeah. Prior to me coming to Lambda School to study UX,
Yeah.
being a product owner and a Scrum Master, I know how they act. My last job, I saw the way the UX designers, our designers at the organization, always have trouble with the developers.
Yes.
They always tend not to develop what was designed. They actually always want the easy road.
Mm-hmm.
And if they go through the easy road, most times it always messes the experience that we actually want for the user. And unfortunately, most times from work experience, I've realized stakeholders, most especially your bosses, my bosses, we always tend to follow the software developers.
Mm-hmm.
So now, how do I get a chance to bridge that, to make sure stakeholders actually listen to what I'm saying? Because if anything goes wrong, if there's anything goes wrong on the app when it's launched, if when the reviews are bad, it's always come back to the UX designers.
Of course.
Most times we always lose our jobs. That's what I.
Okay, so here's a couple of things that I found really successful, and I do mention the fact that I was a software engineer because when I got a 300-page wireframe, right? At the one time, it was like, wow, this is really intense. I'm going to have to go back for a week and really look at it. But the other hand was I was really grateful that the designers took the time to go through all these interactions. So there's a couple ways that you could do that. As a user experience designer, I often found it very, very helpful to work with the business analyst when they write requirements. So we would sit down together, and not only you're having more fun because you're actually doing it with a person, but they're thinking about the business and you're thinking about the user. So straight from creating your functional requirements, you're already looking at problems and you're already starting to solve it. And that solves a big problem, because a lot of times from the business analysts or from the stakeholders, you're coming in afterwards and you're saying, well, okay, this doesn't really align with this. What should we choose? And there's a conflict. But if you work together and you build together, it doesn't have that. Another thing that I usually do is I love pair programming. And when I was a developer, I used to pair program all the time. And you would think that it would waste more time and effort, but actually we got stuff done faster. So as a user experience person, I would sit down with a developer and I would say, okay, we're going to walk through this and I'm going to show you what this is. And we're going to explain it. And then when they have code reviews or they're just about to push, I had to, at Thermo Fisher, my last company, I had to change the way that we were working. It would always be that at the end of the sprint, we would have a sprint review, and then UX would come in, and if something was wrong, we'd put it into the sprint. And I was like, guys, we're doing this backwards. If we're doing 2-week sprints, in the Monday of the second sprint, you should go down and you should work with the developer to make sure that then when they've completed, they actually hit their target. Because nobody likes going back and redoing things. So if you foster a relationship with your Scrum team or your developers, they'll actually call you and say, hey, I just completed this. I'm going to post it. Can you help me and make sure and look at what I'm seeing? It's that relationship that's going to be more successful. It's not antagonistic. It's proactive where you're making something together. And often I found that developers be like, man, I never thought of that. Oh, yeah, we have to do that. They would align to what I was doing because they would see that I really cared about the user. And I wanted to make them successful and do it right so that they would have a great sprint run, and they wouldn't have to redo it in the next sprint because they were wrong. Nobody wants to be wrong. So it's that type of interaction that creates a solid team. And then they realize that they're actually building things. They're just not working on tasks or tickets. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? We have a couple more minutes. Okay. Did you find this valuable? Was it a regurgitation of something that you already knew? Or was this something, did you find anything new about this process or looking at creating design artifacts?
Yes, I found a lot of things new. You know, the way you worked on the sitemaps, I think really makes a lot of sense, and I tend to use both now, so that I'll be able to have more more solutions to the problems I'm trying to solve. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah, UX and tattoos. I see it in the chat window. You know, you don't really want to spend your whole life doing cover-ups. That's not a good scene, right? It's important because a lot of times when I read books and people talk about doing certain things, they say, hey, here's what you can do, and this is you see where it is, and you don't really understand their process. They don't really communicate that it's okay to be messy. It's okay to try things out, right? When I was in graduate school, it was very interesting because my teachers in graduate school were the people in history books that I studied in college. And the way that they worked was completely different than my small liberal art college professors. They thought they knew everything, but the people who were in the MoMA and the Met and all these brilliant people would be like, I don't know, I do this and I see it work and it's really messy. And then I come to it, I go home, I sleep, I come back and I think, oh yeah, this is the way it should be. And their process was a lot more forgiving, and their process was a lot more relaxed because they were allowed to always make 1,000 starts. They never really worried about finishing things. They always started with something and looked at anything. And the reason why is because the answer, the solution, will become apparent if you listen. What you're looking at doing would be like, oh, this is the gap that we're looking for, which is why I showed those examples. So you could see, I did this map, this is where we are, this is the outcome, oh, this doesn't work. Oh, this is what I need to do. It becomes pretty obvious. But we have to listen and we have to record our observations as clearly as possible. And then we have to be empathetic to say, oh, wow, okay, maybe I was wrong, or maybe we're doing this wrong. Let's try this out. And I didn't even get to how these apply to usability testing. And if you never did usability testing or you want to do usability testing, it'll blow your mind because you'll be in the room and you'll be like, click the button, click the button, click the button. And you think it's really obvious, or developers sitting there and they'll be like, wow, they didn't even see the button. I know, right? Yeah. You get this relationship because you could actually see people working on it because they don't have the concept of the problem they're trying to solve. And then you have these design artifacts, which are records that you can go back and you say, remember last January where you did this? Well, this was a great idea. Now we can do that. And that's why you document and you keep tactile records of it, because they become invaluable over time.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. I hope this was helpful. And thank you very much for allowing me to present to you. This was great. And I hope that your studies are very valuable and you enjoy reducing frustration, because people are really frustrated. Okay. Take care.
All right, bye.
All right, bye.